Hello, folks. Zelensky makes another obvious statement, but he is kind of right, like he is occasionally. It's true. Ukraine's victory plan is going to depend on decisions made by allies. Those decisions include, but are not limited to, when to supply aid to Ukraine, whether to supply aid to Ukraine, what kind of aid to supply, what limitations to put on it, whether or not to allow Ukraine to use Western long-range weapons against targets within Russian territory, and so on and so forth. And possibly whether to alter Ukraine's status with respect to NATO and EU, although that is highly unlikely. Both pretty much made it very clear that they're not interested in having Ukraine as their member until after the war is over. I have questions about that, especially in light of the story I talked about yesterday, in which Romania, who is an EU and NATO member, asked Ukraine to help protect it against drones and pieces of Russian drones that end up flying into Romanian territory. So I have a question about how is it okay for Ukraine to defend NATO nations, but it's not okay for NATO to help defend Ukraine, or at least not tie Ukraine's hands behind its back to help defend itself. So we talked about the total casualty numbers. Remember, the total casualty numbers we discussed a couple of days ago, the million people. That includes civilians killed, military killed, and both civilians and military wounded. Something to remember is that we are no longer in the 19th century, we're no longer in the 20th century, we are in the 21st century. So, we have the level of medicine that allows for survival of the wounded who in the past wars would have probably died. That doesn't make it any better because some of the wounded in question have lost all of their limbs or some of their limbs. Some will be basically disabled for life, and some of them are children. So, this particular piece on the BBC website talks about military deaths, and they're estimating it at 70,000 people. This doesn't just include the soldiers who actually do the fighting, who actually do the shooting, who, man the missile launchers, who fire the guns, etc. This also includes medics and volunteers who are there with the troops to assist. So we are talking about folks who distribute supplies. We're talking about folks who cook their food, folks who help with communications, folks who help truck the wounded out of the danger zone, etc. And unfortunately, when you're in a state of war, bullets, shrapnel, missiles, bombs don't care if you're a soldier or a medic or a volunteer. They don't care if you are one of the personnel who never fired a shot. You can get killed anyway. And that includes foreign citizens who chose to go and help out. So that is happening, and again, we know that there have been some horrible deaths and horrible atrocities among the civilians. but we also still determining exactly who ended up in Russian custody in addition to the soldiers. Because I'm sure there are some people there who are not actually military personnel. And yet, God only knows how they were treated. There have been some updates about the results of the Kursk operation. Remember, we talked about Kursk a lot, and there's been a lot of discussion what is the exact purpose of the Kursk operation. And at that time, I told you the same thing as people who are much smarter than I am, that there's not just one goal to this. There's multiple purposes. This was just one of them. The diversion of troops away from the established front line. So remember, we were talking, there's some brutal fighting, the meat grinder, in the Donetsk region, and that has been a concern for a long time. While Ukrainian troops were successful at making Russia's progress very, very slow, excruciatingly slow, in that area, and costing them through the nose. But they definitely could use some relief there. And so right now, what we're getting from Ukraine's government is that 40,000 Russian troops were diverted from that area to try and react to Ukrainians' incursion into the Kursk region. So, if that is true, and I'm still looking to double check this, but if this is true, then it's working. Also, so far, none of Russian government's statements about recapturing any territory in the Kursk region could be verified by any independent sources. So they're saying they're making progress there against Ukrainian troops, but they show no evidence of it, and nobody can find any evidence on it. So it remains an open question. That, of course, doesn't stop them from continuing to murder Ukrainian civilians. The latest in the series of horrific attacks against Ukrainian people has been an attack in the Sumy, where they targeted a geriatric care home. This is from like the How Low Can You Stoop series. What, there were NATO agents hiding in there? Or was it like an army barrack masquerading as a care home for the elder? So they killed one person, 12 persons were wounded, and rescue teams are still checking, as always, on site to see if anybody was trapped under the ruins of the building. Every autumn, Russian government, Russian media starts repeating the same thing, saying, if Ukrainians will not surrender, we're going to freeze them to death. And so this is like third winter in a row. And check this. So this is so useful. UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine says attacks on the infrastructure probably violated humanitarian law. Probably. They're not sure. Really? This is why so many of us have completely soured on all of these human rights organizations, because of how lame they have been throughout the war in Ukraine. They have probably committed atrocities. They have maybe endangered human lives. They have probably violated humanitarian law. Grow up.